Hello again. I thought I might read out a bit more from the book which I have coming out next year, one of the books. May I just remind people, though, that it's a humorous work designed with no more elevated aim in mind than to make people laugh. This is from the introduction entitled What Psychopathy Can Do for You. Psychopaths, or sociopaths as they are sometimes called by the mealy-mouthed, have a pretty poor reputation. Behaving, or even just thinking like a psychopath, is generally regarded as undesirable, something to be avoided if at all possible. This is odd because psychopaths, along with other narcissists, tend to lead very happy and fulfilled lives. Despite their lack of empathy, they usually enjoy themselves more than most of us and rarely suffer from anxiety or depression. This is because, unlike the majority of ordinary people, such individuals are honest to themselves about who they are and also understand and acknowledge the true nature of the world and their own place in it. A natural consequence is that psychopaths almost invariably put their own needs and desires above those of others. Such naked and unashamed selfishness is viewed askance these days, when so many of us pretend to care more about the plight of Amazonian rainforest dwellers than we do about our own gross material needs. A recent piece of research shed light on this subject and confirmed what has long been suspected, that the psychopathic or narcissistic mentality is not necessarily a bad thing in itself and can actually lead to a more satisfying and healthy outlook on life. A few years ago, Dr. Kostas Papageorgiou began a project at Queen's University in Belfast, the aim of which was to study narcissists. Narcissists are similar in many ways to psychopaths. In Dr. Papageorgiou's words, narcissism is part of the dark tetrad of personality that also includes Machiavellianism, psychopathy and sadism. Narcissists, like psychopaths, are not overburdened with empathy, feel that their own wishes and desires are more important than those of others, that they are more deserving of attention and also have a greater right than others to have their needs satisfied. You might think that people with such shockingly distorted attitudes would be unhappy and unfulfilled, inadequate individuals with thoroughly unrealistic expectations of life. This proved not to be the case at all. When the results of the research were revealed in 2019, it was seen that the frank absence of empathy, a common feature of both narcissists and psychopaths, had a beneficial effect upon the mental well-being of those whom Dr. Papageorgiou and his team of researchers examined. They were happier, less stressed, and not nearly as prone to depression as the general population. So impressed was Dr. Papageorgiou by the psychological well-being of the narcissists with whom he came into contact in the course of his work that he recommended the rest of us to consider the advantages of narcissism rather than focusing on the less attractive parts of the syndrome. He said, while of course not all dimensions of narcissism are good, certain aspects can lead to positive outcomes. All this is relevant to any discussion of psychopathy, because although not all narcissists are psychopaths, there can be no doubt that all psychopaths are narcissists, and therefore what is said of narcissists usually applies equally to psychopaths. Because psychopaths are honest about their wishes and desires, at least to themselves, they get their own way a lot of the time. This is hardly surprising. You're far more likely to get what you want if you know what that is. They may lack certain emotions, but these tend to be the kind of things which none of us want anyway. Feelings such as guilt, regret, self-doubt, fear, anxiety and frustration. Psychopaths are like humans 2.0, men and women who are free of neuroses and restraints, unhindered by conscience and untouched by remorse. In short, they are independent individuals who are able to enjoy life to the full without seeking the approval of others. Some readers might recall a classic line in the old movie Love Story, to the effect that love means never having to say sorry. Being a psychopath means never having to feel sorry. A closer look at the features of psychopathy should make this a little clearer. What are the chief characteristics which distinguish psychopaths from the rest of us? According to one clinical definition, psychopaths display a lack of social emotion such as shame, guilt and embarrassment. One feels obliged to ask, is this a bad thing? What normal, healthy person wishes to feel guilty, ashamed or embarrassed? They also have a single-minded determination to satisfy their own needs and desires. Again, we're tempted to observe, so what? This single-minded determination to get what you want is usually known as ambition, and only a psychiatrist would view it in such a negative sense. The typical psychopath is superficially charming as well. Well, most of us wish that we appeared more charming to others. What's wrong with that? It will not have escaped notice that these pseudoscientific definitions are intended to make psychopaths sound like defective outsiders, men and women quite different from the rest of us. Over the last 40 or 50 years, this has been effective in shaping popular perception and making almost everybody a little wary of psychopaths, seeing them all as being potential serial killers or at the very least conscienceless scam artists and exploiters of the vulnerable and weak. Working one's way carefully and methodically through the diagnostic criteria for psychopathy, though, soon reveals that once the subjective language is stripped away and the value judgments rephrased in neutral terms, it is found that psychopaths are simply people who want the same things as the rest of us, but are prepared to be honest about their desires and the means they use in order to obtain what they want. Rather than following convention and pretending to regard dysfunctional psychological phenomena such as contrition and remorse in pseudo-religious terms and trying to pass them off as praiseworthy virtues, the psychopath discards the notions entirely and does very well without them. Psychopaths do not deceive themselves about their own feelings and thoughts. This refreshing honesty and lack of cant is one of the most admirable features of true psychopathy. If the rest of us could only achieve such clarity of thought and rid ourselves of all the pretense and false sentiment which muddles up and confuses our minds, the world around us would be hugely simplified and we would be much happier. Never was this more necessary, for the developed world is currently in the grip of a psychological and spiritual crisis. Hand in hand with the rising prosperity of the Western world over the last half-century or so, has come a corresponding increase in mental illness, psychosomatic disorders and psychological disturbances of all kinds. We might be incomparably better off from a strictly material viewpoint than our parents and grandparents, but at the same time we seem to grow more neurotic and anxious with each passing year. The reason is not hard to find. Due to changing patterns of life, most of us are forced to endure tensions and stresses which were in the past freakishly rare, but are now the rule rather than the exception. Some of the severest of these stressors are an integral part of family life for many people, which makes them inescapable. Even worse is the fact that hypocrisy renders it impossible to discuss these problems even with our families. Especially with our families, in fact. One or two examples might make this idea easier to grasp. Progress in medical science means that our parents linger on longer after they would once have been consigned to the grave. Not only do middle-aged people now have to put up with querulous, annoying and demanding old relatives whose health and mental faculties are failing, they also see any inheritance dwindling away before their eyes, squandered on stair lifts, nursing home fees and so on. Where once parents died at a reasonable age, perhaps in late 60s or early 70s, they now seem to hang on forever. This imposes a dreadful psychological burden on their adult children, who find the aged relatives a terrible nuisance from which they can never quite free themselves. Not only that, they feel a gnawing resentment that the property and money which they hoped would come to them and perhaps enable them to pay off their own mortgages and perhaps provide one or two luxuries, such as a new car and a few decent holidays, is being frittered away on carers or used to fund a place in a residential unit. The most frustrating part of it is that the victims feel unable to complain about this iniquitous situation, lest they appear to be heartless, callous and grasping individuals. Worse still, they do not even admit to themselves how they are feeling. It is this tension, anger and resentment that cannot be openly acknowledged even to themselves which many middle-aged people now find themselves suffering for years on end. All too often it is exacerbated by another problem of modern industrialised society, the scourge of the so-called blended family. Only a few decades ago the stepchild was seldom encountered outside the pages of fairy tales such as Cinderella. Now though, a huge number of families harbour such intruders, and these are an additional source of frustration and annoyance for all too many parents. Few of us like other people's children, and this becomes especially noticeable when you are stuck with them in your home indefinitely. Just as in the case of the awkward old parents who seem determined to cling so tenaciously to life, nobody can actually say out loud what they feel about these cuckoos in the nest. Instead, they must maintain the ludicrous fiction that they love these children as much as their own flesh and blood. Few people are deceived by these proclamations of love, but only the most daring of us would risk stating the obvious, that our parents' children get on our nerves. This then is applied to many modern families, a lot of whose older members belong to what is sometimes called the sandwich generation. They're tormented not only by having ageing parents, but also stepchildren. In neither case do they feel able to express their real feelings, being obliged to maintain the pretense that they love and cherish the very people who are making their lives such a burden. It is hardly surprising then that this seething maelstrom of unresolved tensions and unacknowledged anger should manifest itself in physical ailments of a vague and indefinable nature. These, together with other modern problems such as the ubiquity of the internet and our changing view of the world of work, largely account for the epidemics which we have seen in the West of mysterious maladies such as ME, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, allergies to wheat, intolerance to milk, panic attacks, anorexia and 1,001 other bodily and psychological disorders, which create such misery and yet leave no physical trace in the bodies of the afflicted. These psychosomatic ailments are a product of social rather than clinical factors. There is good news, though, for those whose stomach knots up inexplicably, or whose limbs feel like leaden weights as a result of modern life. The medical profession may be unable to identify the nature of the problem, let alone provide a remedy for it, but relief is nonetheless at hand. It need not be this way. We all of us have a kernel of psychopathy within us, which from childhood onwards we have been taught to suppress and conceal. Most people become so adept at this that they even manage to hide the psychopathic side of their personalities from themselves. We do this because we've been persuaded by our parents, schools, governments, religions and society in general that we must do our best not to listen to our natural feelings or acknowledge our deepest instincts. The result is that we waste a good deal of our lives feeling frustrated and angry when we could instead be cheerful and relaxed. The answer lies in studying and then adopting the way of the psychopath. In this book you will learn how to nurture the psychopath hiding within you, instead of locking it away and denying its very existence as though it were the mad woman in the attic from Jane Eyre. Of course, nobody is advocating behaving like a psychopath, merely thinking like one. The sheer relief of admitting to oneself that the ageing mother really is an intolerable nuisance, or the stepson one pretends to cherish an unendurable parasite, can itself be a liberating and even exhilarating experience. It is not being suggested that an annoying and obtrusive family member should be dispatched with a hatchet or smothered in bed with a pillow over their face, hugely satisfying as such a final resolution might be to the problem. The psychological benefits can be reaped not merely by such physical actions, but just by learning to accept and even laugh at the vexatious conundrums with which so many of us are compelled to grapple. This book is less about murdering those who frustrate your pursuit of happiness than it is learning to call things by their right names. In other words, calling a spade rather than a manual digging implement. In doing so, we will be able to come to terms with the predicaments in which our everyday life constantly places us.